I was working the front desk at a boutique hotel in Prague when an American businessman walked up to me, pointed at the temperature display showing 22 seconds C, and asked if we had air conditioning. I told him yes. The room was climate-controlled. He shook his head and said, "No, I mean real air conditioning. It's showing 22 degrees in there. That's freezing. I needed at least 72. I just stared at him. He was dead serious. I had to pull up a conversion chart on my phone to show him that 22 Celsius was actually 72 Fahrenheit. He looked at the numbers, looked at me, and said, "Well, why don't you just use normal degrees?" Then he walked away, like I was the confusing one. That same week, a couple from Texas checked in and asked where they could park their rental car overnight. I explained our parking situation, told them the daily rate was 400 crowns. The husband pulled out a 500 crown note, handed it to me and said, "Keep the change, buddy." I tried to explain that 400 crowns was about $18, not $4. He just winked and said, "I know how it works in Europe. You guys love American tips." His wife was already halfway to the elevator. I ended up having to chase them down with a receipt because our system flagged the unpaid parking fee. But my favorite was the woman who came down to breakfast, looked at the buffet spread, and asked me where the regular coffee was. I pointed to the coffee station with 3 different machines. She said, "No, I mean like normal coffee, just black coffee in a pot." We had espresso, Americano, cappuccino, all fresh. She wanted drip coffee from a glass pot that had been sitting on a burner for 2 hours. When I explained we made coffee fresh to order, she said, "That's fancy, but I just want coffee. You know, the kind that comes in a Folgers can?" I made her an Americano. She took 1 sip and asked if we had any Splenda, because this tastes too strong. These weren't isolated incidents. Every week brought new conversations that made me question if we were living on the same planet. And I'm not talking about language barriers. Most of these folks spoke perfect English. They just had this way of looking at the world that was so specifically American, so confident in how things should work, that reality itself seemed negotiable. The measurements were wrong. The coffee was fancy. The money was confusing. And somehow, it was always Europe that needed to adjust. But that was just the beginning. Because once you start paying attention to these moments, you realize they happen everywhere. In restaurants, airports, grocery stores, train stations. There's an entire parallel universe of interactions happening where Americans are saying things that make locals stop mid-sentence and recalibrate their understanding of cultural differences. I was working as a museum guide in Amsterdam when an American college student raised her hand during a tour and asked why Anne Frank didn't just move to a different house. The whole group went quiet. I thought maybe she was joking, but her face was completely earnest. She explained that if Anne Frank knew the Nazis were looking for Jewish people, why would she stay in Amsterdam? Why not just go to, like, a different city? Or a different country? I tried to explain the occupation, the restrictions, the whole historical context. She nodded along but then said, "Right. But couldn't they just say they weren't Jewish? Like, how would anyone even know?" Another person in the tour group, an older Dutch woman, just turned around and walked into the next room. I still think about that student sometimes. She was studying international relations. A few months later, I was helping a family from California navigate the Van Gogh Museum. The dad kept asking why Van Gogh didn't just go to therapy instead of cutting off his ear. He said it maybe 3 times in different rooms. Guy clearly needed therapy. His teenage son pointed out that modern psychology barely existed in the 1880s. The dad said, "Yeah, but talking to someone is universal, right? He could have talked to a priest or something." Then, he looked at Starry Night and asked why Van Gogh didn't just paint happy things if he was so depressed. Maybe he'd have felt better, he said. His wife was taking selfies and didn't participate in any of this. I once had a tourist from Florida ask me if the canals in Amsterdam were natural. I explained they were. Built by hand in the 17th century, he looked genuinely shocked. Wait, you guys dug all this by hand? I confirmed. He thought about it for a moment, then asked, why didn't they just fill them back in when cars were invented? I told him the canals are part of the UNESCO World Heritage Site. They're the entire reason Amsterdam looks the way it does. He said, sure, but wouldn't roads be more practical? I didn't know how to explain that. Not. Everything exists for maximum car efficiency. He left thinking I was being difficult. The wildest one was a woman who asked me if Dutch people were born speaking English. I laughed at first because I thought she was making a joke. She wasn't. She'd been in Amsterdam for 4 days, and everyone she met spoke English, so she assumed it was just part of being Dutch. I explained that we learn it in school, that it's a second language for most people. She looked almost disappointed. Oh, she said. I thought maybe it was like a genetic thing, like how some people are good at math. I told her language doesn't work that way. She said, yeah, but some countries just seem naturally better at it. I let that one go. There wasn't enough time in the day. Later that season, I had a couple from Arizona ask if the Rijksmuseum was the real one or a replica. I asked what they meant. The wife said they'd seen pictures of it online and wanted to make sure this was the actual museum and not like a second location. I assured them it was the original building from 1885. The husband then asked if the paintings inside were originals or copies. I said they were originals. He seemed skeptical. All of them, he asked. Don't they usually keep the real ones in storage? I explained that museums display their actual collections. He said, huh. In America, they usually have the real stuff in a vault somewhere. I have no idea what museum he was thinking of. Maybe he confused art museums with bank vaults. His wife asked if we had a gift shop. That conversation was easier. The last one that broke me was a study abroad student who asked why Dutch people don't just speak American, not English. American. I tried to clarify and she said, you know, like how we talk in the US. It's easier than British English, right? I explained that American English is just a dialect of English, and that Dutch people learn standard international English. She said, okay, but wouldn't American be more useful since most tourists are American? I pointed out that most tourists in Amsterdam are not American. She didn't believe me. Really? She said. Because everyone I've met here has been from the States. I asked if she'd considered that maybe she was only talking to other American tourists. She thought about it and said, wow, that's like a really good point. She tipped me €5. I still don't know if that was condescending or sincere. I was working at a pharmacy in Stockholm when an American woman came in asking for cold medicine. I showed her what we had, explained the dosages. She picked up a box, looked at the instructions, and her face fell. This is in milliliters, she said. I told her yes. That's how we measure liquid medicine, she said. But how am I supposed to know how much that is? I pointed to the measuring cup inside the box. She shook her head. I need it in tablespoons. I don't know milliliters. I tried to explain that 1 tablespoon is about 15 milliliters. She asked if I had a chart. I didn't. She ended up buying the medicine but looked genuinely stressed about it. She kept muttering, why can't they just use normal measurements? A week later, a guy from Michigan came in needing pain medication. I asked his weight to calculate the proper dosage. He said, about 190. I asked if that was kilograms or pounds. He stared at me like I'd asked him to solve a calculus problem. Pounds, he said slowly. Why would I know kilograms? I did the conversion in my head, about 86 kilograms. I recommended a dosage. He asked why Swedish medicine was so weak compared to American painkillers. I explained it was the same active ingredient. just measured in milligrams instead of whatever unit he was used to. He said American medicine was just stronger and bought the Swedish version anyway while mumbling about European regulations. The temperature thing happened constantly. I was helping a tourist from Georgia who wanted to know if she needed a jacket for the evening. I checked my phone. It was going to be about 12 degrees. She gasped. 12 degrees? That's below freezing. I need a winter coat. I had to explain Celsius to her. She listened, nodded, then asked, "But why don't you just use Fahrenheit? It makes more sense." I asked how Fahrenheit made more sense. She said, "Because 0 is freezing and 100 is hot. That's easy." I pointed out that in Celsius, 0 is freezing and 100 is boiling, which is based on water's actual physical properties. She said, "Okay, but who needs to know when water boils? I'm just trying to figure out if I need a jacket." Fair point. Honestly, I once had a man ask me why Swedish roads had speed limits in random numbers. I asked what he meant. He said he kept seeing signs that said 50, 70, 90. Why not just round numbers like 55 or 65? I explained those were kilometers per hour, not miles. He said, "Right, but 90 kilometers is like 55 miles, which is a weird speed limit." I told him 90 kilometers per hour is about 56 miles per hour, which is pretty standard for a highway. He said, "See, but that's confusing. Why not just make it 90 miles? I didn't have a good answer for why Sweden refuses to restructure its entire measurement system for American clarity. The best one was a couple who came in asking for acetaminophen. I showed them paracetamol. They said no. They needed acetaminophen specifically because that's what their doctor recommended. I explained that paracetamol and acetaminophen are the same thing, just different names. The husband didn't believe me. They wouldn't use a different name for the same medicine, he said. That would be confusing. I showed him the chemical formula on both packages. Identical. His wife said, "Okay, but which one is the American version?" I told her acetaminophen is just what Americans call it. She asked if she could take the Swedish version safely. I confirmed, yes, it's literally the same drug. They bought it but seemed uncertain. The husband said, "I guess we'll see if it works." Later that month, a woman asked me about driving distances. She wanted to know how far it was from Stockholm to Copenhagen. I said about 650 kilometers. She asked what that was in regular distance. I said, "Miles?" She said yes. I told her about 400 miles. She said, "Why didn't you just say that?" I explained that Sweden uses the metric system. She said, "Right, but everyone knows miles." I asked if she knew kilometers. She said no. I said, "Exactly. That's how we feel about miles." She didn't appreciate the comparison. She asked if I could just give her directions in miles from now on. I told her the road signs would be in kilometers. She said that was going to be a problem for her. I suggested she use her phone's GPS, which could convert units. She said her phone was on airplane mode to save money. I couldn't help her after that. The absolute peak was a guy who came in with a prescription from his American doctor. The dosage was written in grains, actual grains, an apothecary measurement from the 1800s. I had to look it up. 1 grain equals about 65 milligrams. His prescription was for 10 grains of aspirin, which would be 650 milligrams. I explained we'd have to convert it. He asked why. I said, because Swedish pharmacies use the metric system. He said, "But my doctor wrote it in grains." I told him that's an outdated measurement. He said, "It's what American doctors use." I showed him that modern American prescriptions use milligrams too. He insisted his doctor was old school. I made the conversion, gave him the medicine. He asked if I was sure this is the same amount. I confirmed, yes. He took it, but looked suspicious. Pretty sure he thought Swedish pharmacists were just winging it. I was working as a taxi driver in Buenos Aires when I picked up an American tourist. From the airport, he asked how far we were from Brazil. I said about 1,000 kilometers to the nearest border. He said, "So like an hour?" I laughed, thought he was joking. He wasn't. I explained that 1,000 kilometers was maybe a 12-hour drive. He looked confused. "But aren't we in South America?" he asked. I confirmed. He said, "Then how is Brazil far? It's right next to Argentina." I tried to explain that South America is massive, that Argentina alone is bigger than Greenland. He said, "Wait, Greenland is small? I didn't even know where to start with that one." We rode in silence for a bit. Then he asked if we took US dollars in Buenos Aires. I said some places do, but pesos are better. He handed me a $20 bill and said that should cover the ride. The fare was 3,000 pesos, about $30 at the time. He seemed offended when I asked for more money. A few weeks later, I had a woman from Oregon who asked if we could drive to Machu Picchu from Buenos Aires. I said no. "That's in Peru," she said. "Right, but how long would that take?" I told her Peru is a different country, at least a 3-day drive, and Machu Picchu is in the mountains, so you'd need to fly and then take a train. She said, "That seems complicated. Isn't there a highway?" I explained South American geography isn't like the US interstate system. She said, "But it's all connected, right?" "Technically, yes. But I wasn't about to explain the Pan-American highway gap in Panama. She decided to just stay in Buenos Aires, probably for the best. I once picked up a couple who asked if Argentine people speak Mexican. I said no, we speak Spanish. The wife said, "What's the difference?" I explained that Mexican Spanish and Argentine Spanish are both Spanish, but with different accents and some vocabulary differences. The husband said, "So it's like American and British?" I said sort of. He said, "Then why don't you just call it Argentine?" I said we do, informally. He seemed satisfied with that. Then he asked if I knew any Mexican restaurants in Buenos Aires. I recommended a taco place. He said, "Perfect." We wanted authentic South American food. I didn't correct him. The taco place was run by Mexicans anyway. Close enough. The weirdest geography moment was a guy who asked if Argentina was in Europe. I said no, South America. He said, "But everyone here is white." I explained Argentina's immigration history, the large Italian and Spanish populations, he said. "So it's like Europe, but in South America?" I said that's oversimplifying it, but sure. He then asked if that meant Argentina was in the EU. I said no. The European Union is for European countries. He said, "But if the people are European?" I cut him off and explained citizenship, geography, and international borders. He said, "Man, this is confusing." I agreed. Then he asked if his phone would work here, or if he needed a European SIM card. Told him he needed an international plan or a local SIM. He said his carrier told him his phone would work in the Americas. I confirmed it should work. He said, "So I don't need a European one?" I said correct. He seemed relieved. I still don't think he understood where Argentina actually is. I had a family from Texas ask me about the seasons. It was July, winter in Argentina. They were shocked it was cold. "But it's summer," the dad said. I explained that seasons are reversed in the southern hemisphere. He said, "Wait, what?" I broke down the Earth's tilt, how when it's summer in North America, it's winter in South America. His teenage daughter said, "Oh yeah, we learned that in school." The dad still looked skeptical. "So Christmas here is in summer?" I confirmed. He said, "That's weird. How do you do Christmas without snow?" I pointed out that most of the world doesn't have snow at Christmas. He said, "Huh, never thought about it." His wife asked if they sold winter jackets in Argentina. I confirmed we did. She seemed surprised. The absolute strangest was a woman who insisted Buenos Aires was the capital of Chile. I politely corrected her, said, Buenos Aires is the capital of Argentina. Santiago is Chile's capital. She pulled out her phone, looked something up, then showed me a map. She'd Googled Buenos Aires, Chile, and found a small town in Chile called Buenos Aires. She said, "See? It's right here." I zoomed out on her map, showed her Buenos Aires, Argentina, the massive city we were currently in. She squinted at her phone. "Oh," she said, "there's two of them?" I said yes, but one is a town of a few hundred people, and one is a city of 3 million. She said, "Well, that's confusing. They should name them different things." I suggested that the 16th century, Spanish colonists probably weren't worried about American tourists. Confusion. She didn't laugh. She asked if we could drive to the other Buenos Aires while she was here. Said it was about 400 kilometers away. She said, "Is that far?" I said yes. She decided to skip it. Probably saved herself a very boring trip to rural Chile. The final one was a guy who asked if Argentina had states. I said we have provinces. He said, "What's the difference?" I explained that provinces are similar to states, but with some different governmental structures. He said, "So they're basically states," I said functionally. "Kind of." He asked which province we were in. I said Buenos Aires province, though the city of Buenos Aires is technically separate. He said, "Wait, so the city and the province have the same name?" I confirmed. He said, "That's like if New York City was in New York State." I said, "Exactly." He paused. "Wait, New York City is in New York State." I nodded. He said, "Oh, I guess that makes sense then." Sometimes the conversation just loops back on itself. I was working at a small restaurant in Kyoto when an American woman in her 60s came in for lunch. She looked at the menu, looked at me, and asked if we had a children's menu. I said no. We didn't typically do that in Japan. She said, "That's fine. I'll just have chicken nuggets." I told her we didn't have chicken nuggets. She looked around the restaurant like she was checking if I was lying. "You don't have chicken nuggets?" she asked. I confirmed. She said, "What kind of restaurant doesn't have chicken nuggets?" I explained we specialized in traditional Kyoto cuisine, kaiseki-style meals, seasonal ingredients. She listened, then said, "Okay, but what do kids eat here?" I told her that Japanese children eat the same food as adults, just smaller portions. She looked genuinely baffled. "They eat raw fish?" I said sometimes yes. She shook her head. "That can't be healthy." She ended up ordering grilled fish because it was cooked. When it arrived with the head still on, she pushed the plate away and said she couldn't eat something that was looking at her. I offered to remove the head. She said no. She'd lost her appetite. She asked if we had a burger place nearby. I gave her directions to a Yoshoku restaurant that served Western-style food. She asked if they had normal burgers, not Japanese ones. I said they had hamburger steaks, which is what Japanese Yoshoku restaurants serve. She asked what the difference was. I explained that a hamburger steak is a ground beef patty with gravy, served with rice. She said, "So, it's not a burger." I confirmed it's technically not a burger. She asked, "Why call it a hamburger then?" I said it's a translation thing. She said, "Japan is confusing." Before she left, she asked me one more question. "Do Japanese people ever eat normal food?" I asked what she meant by normal. She said, "You know, like pizza, pasta, sandwiches." I told her yes, Japan has all of those things. She looked relieved. "Oh, good," she said. "I was worried everyone just ate weird stuff all the time." I didn't tell her that pizza in Japan often has corn and mayonnaise on it. She'd been through enough for one day. She paid her bill, left me a 1,000 yen note as a tip, even though I explained tipping isn't customary in Japan, and walked out into the Kyoto afternoon looking for familiar food in a city built on 200 years of culinary tradition. I watched her go and thought about how many versions of this exact interaction were probably happening right now in restaurants, hotels, and train stations all over the world. Americans asking for normalcy in places where normal means something completely different. And the wild part? Tomorrow, someone else will walk in and ask me the exact same question about chicken nuggets. Because these stories, they never stop coming.